Good morning, everybody. We are beginning our third section of our international workshop. And today we have the pleasure to, as the keynote speaker, Professor Jesus Ferreiro, that is Professor of Economics at the University of Basque, Spain, and associate member of the Center for Economic and Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, and also member of our Structuralist Development Macroeconomic Research Group. Pleasure to have here, Jesus. And the title of the presentation is Fiscal Policy and Long-Term Economic Growth, Lessons from the Euro Area. Jesus will talk about 40 minutes. After that, we will have the discussion. Please, you can. We are going to collect the questions in the YouTube, and we'll discuss with Jesus. Many thanks, Jesus. Pleasure to have you here.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis Fernando. I hope you are now listening me fine and with no problems, and you can be watching at the slides that I will use during my presentation. So let me, before starting with the main content of the paper, obviously I want to thank you the opportunity and the invitation of the organizers of this workshop to participate, given plenary speak about a theme that can be something different to what someone could expect about the content of the workshop, because instead of talking of dual or emerging and developing countries, I will present a paper focused on the economic situation and the macroeconomic strategy in advances in a specific case of advanced economy, but it is the case of the euro area. So first of all, I would like to explain the reason of the choice of this topic. And the main reason is that among the determinants of the processes of development, economic growth, and long-term structural change, the structural development macroeconomics highlights the role played by the macroeconomic policy regime, that is the strategy of fiscal, monetary, and also exchange rate policies. Although this approach has focused mainly on the study of developing and emerging economies, mainly Latin American countries, our paper focuses, on the contrary, on the European economies that make up the euro area. The reason for this is the growing consensus that the macroeconomic policy in the euro area, especially the fiscal policy, based on a strong economic orthodoxy, has adversely affected economic growth while generating at the same time growing economic and social imbalances. In other words, the macroeconomic policy strategy implemented in this area would be one of the main causes of the secular stagnation affecting the euro area and of its lower dynamics compared to other advances in emerging economies. So in our opinion, this can offer useful lessons to other, in this case, emerging countries whose objective is to catch up advances economies, and to do this, they want to implement the proper macroeconomic policy strategy. So in this sense, in our paper, we will present in the first part what would be the general framework in what the theoretical general framework in which is based the macroeconomic policy strategy implemented in the euro area. So in this sense, we are beginning what would be the main features of the new consensus economics, that is, we can identify with the economic policy, macroeconomic policy prescription from the new Keynesian economics. So for this orthodoxy, for the orthodox economics that I was saying I am identifying with the new Keynesian economics, monetary policy based on inflation targeting is the central tool of macroeconomic policy, ensuring stable and sustained non-inflationary growth and reducing economic volatility. Fiscal policy would play a secondary and passive role, facilitating the working of monetary policy. To this end, fiscal policy should avoid generating public deficit and ensure an orthodox, that is, a non-monetary financing of public deficits. In this framework, expansionary fiscal policy do not have an expansionary, a positive impact on economic activity, because the multiplier of fiscal policy would be zero. In fact, under certain circumstances, the long-run multiplier of fiscal policy could even be negative, so that fiscal adjustment policies would have an expansionary effect on economic activity, especially if they are based on unproductive spending cuts accompanied with tax cuts. In this sense, in this economic orthodoxy, it's also considered that a large part of public expenditure and revenue items would have a negative impact on aggregate supply, generating an inefficient allocation of resources in the private sector, and thus negatively affecting productivity in the accumulation of productive factors, that is, capital and labor. There would thus be, in these economies, an optimal size of the public sector, about which it would exert a negative effect on economic activity and economic growth, a size or threshold that will be taken for granted that would have been exceeded in most countries, especially in European countries. However, in recent years, this approach has been challenged not only by heterodox, mainly post-Keynesian economists, but also by some orthodox economists such as Blanchard or Summer, who defend the existence of a new consensus. In recent paper, they are defending the existence of a new consensus in advanced economies in favor of a higher activism of fiscal policies as the main instrument for macroeconomic stabilization. It might be said that for the latter authors, that is, by people like Blanchard, Summer, and so on, the defense of an active fiscal policy is fundamentally based on the existence of a specific set of circumstances that allow for greater fiscal activism, namely the existence of secular stagnation, which would be caused by an insufficient aggregate demand, the existence of zero interest rates and very low inflation rates, and in general, an economic environment that guarantees the sustainability of public debt. It should also be borne in mind that these approaches are reinforced by recent empirical studies, which suggest that active countercyclical fiscal policy have positive effects on economic activity and economic growth. Thus, the non-linearity of fiscal multipliers is being recognized. That is, it is being now accepted that the value of the multipliers depends on the economic context in which fiscal measures are implemented. It's also accepted that the size of public sector works as an automatic stabilizer, helping to smooth the impact of demand and supply shocks, reducing economic volatility, and helping to avoid hysteresis and scarring effects. On the other hand, it is accepted that fiscal policy and public expenditures and public revenues have a positive impact on income distribution, enabling a more egalitarian personal and functional distribution of incomes, which would stimulate economic activity by stimulating private consumption and thus reducing the dependence of economic growth on external demand. It is also argued that some categories of public expenditure can be considered as productive, that is, items that enhance efficiency and that also have a positive impact on long-run economic activity. We are talking of public expenditures such as spending in education, health, R&D, active labor market policies, public investment, and also some categories of social expenditures that can have a positive impact, provided that its size is not, say, excessive. Finally, it is accepted that fiscal austerity can have or is having a negative impact on economic activity, both in the short and the long term, through the well-known hysteresis effects, as well as on personal and functional income distribution. this negative impact can be stronger when fiscal adjustment is based on cuts in productive impact spending items and on reductions in budgetary items that have a greater impact on income distribution, and also if the size of public sector declines as a consequence of this fiscal consolidation process. Before assessing the effects and the logic of the macroeconomic policy in the euro area that we will see is based on this theoretical framework, I think it's necessary to make a few brief notes on the logic, the economic logics underlying the process of European integration, the construction of monetary, something that will help us to understand the performance, the economic performance of the euro area during the last 2-3 decades. In this sense, we must start mentioning the fact that in the year 1986, the Single European Act was signed. This treaty aimed to achieve full economic integration, forming a single market in Europe among the members of the European Union by the date of the year 1992. To this end, during these years, measures were taken to fully liberalize intra-EU economic and financial trade. What was achieved fully in the 1 year before the planned year, that is, was achieved in the year 1991, 30 years ago. The integration of national markets into a single market, together with economic and trade liberalization and the exchange rate stability made possible by the working of the European monetary system, was supposed to achieve the objectives of accelerating growth by allowing a more efficient relocation of productive resources at the European level. This should and would lead to higher trade flows by increasing the external competitiveness of European economies, solving the problem of the low or very low European growth, known as this year as the problem of, as it was usually mentioned, Eurosclerosis. However, as soon as the single market was established, full financial liberalization combined with an inadequate and mistaken coordination of national economic policies led to the crisis of the European monetary system in the years 1991 and 1992. This crisis proved the problems of implementing autonomous national fiscal and monetary policy strategies in an environment of exchange rate stability and full liberalization of capital flows. The response to this problem was the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in the year 1992. To eliminate exchange rate and economic instability, full monetary integration was considered as essential. This meant replacing national currencies with a single currency and adopted a single monetary and exchange rate policy for all the members of the European Economic and Monetary Union. The existence of a single monetary policy without a genuine single fiscal policy within the euro area, in this sense, we must remember that we lack of say, federal budget at the level of the EU, and because among other reasons, the size of the European Union budget is very, very small. Indeed, it cannot be above 1.5% of the EU gross national income, made it necessary to establish rules that guarantee an adequate coordination of national fiscal policies with each other and also of national fiscal policies with a single monetary policy. The aim of these rules was to avoid potential domestic and external problems generated by discretionary national fiscal policy in the form, for instance, of negative impact on the working of monetary union, negative spillovers of fiscal imbalances on other European economies, the problems of crowding out and exchange rate crowding out the effects, and also to avoid explosive and unsustainable fiscal imbalances that may affect other economies. For these reasons, the Maastricht Treaty established the existence of, or approved the existence of fiscal rules that affected both the candidates to join the euro area. We are talking of the well-known nominal convergence criteria, but also they affected to the member countries once the European Monetary Union was established. The Maastricht Treaty also set sanctions for the latter, for the member countries, in the event of non-compliance of these fiscal rules. The aim of these rules was to avoid the generation of excessive public deficit, who would be subject to sanctions. Understood this excessive public deficit as a situation where there are public deficits above 3% of the GDP, and when the size of the gross public debt of the general government as a whole was above 60% of the GDP. Furthermore, moreover, the Maastricht Treaty also prohibited the monetary or privileged financing of fiscal imbalance in both the EU and the national budgets. It also prohibited the bailout of a country by other countries of the European or even by the European institutions, which implies the absence of a true international solidarity between the European Union and also in the euro area. Finally, we cannot forget that these fiscal rules were accompanied by a monetary policy implemented by an European Central Bank, a bank that is fully independent of European and national political authorities and whose primary objective is to ensure price stability. This price stability that is defined by the statute of the European Central Bank as a rate of inflation below but close to 2%. Before focusing on the problems generated by the working of fiscal policy in the euro area since its very beginning, a few notes on about the fiscal numerology of the Maastricht Treaty, that is a few comments about the choice of the debt and deficit ceiling set in the Maastricht Treaty must be given. We must recall that the starting point of these fiscal rules was to ensure the sustainability of fiscal imbalances. Thus, starting from a desirable maximum size for government debt, public debt, the maximum size of the government deficit that ensures debt stability depends on the nominal GDP growth rate, according to the formula that you can see and the transparency. That is, the government deficit must be equal to the nominal GDP growth rate times the size as a percentage of the GDP of public debt. This formula implies that starting for a public debt of 60% of the GDP, if the economy grows annually at the nominal growth rate, it's important, nominal, not real, of 5%, a deficit of 3%, equivalent to 3% of the GDP, allows this debt to be maintained at the level of the 60%, with both imbalances, fiscal deficit and also public debt, being sustainable, that is, remaining constant over time. Well, what is the reason behind this specific ceiling, these specific figures? We must take into account and we must stress the fact that these figures corresponded to the figures for Germany in the years before the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, the years before the German reunification. The political factor behind this choice must be taken into account. Germany's objective was to form a monetary union with a small number of members. By setting the convergence criteria, these figures, the aim was to prevent, at least initially, that the European Union, the European countries with the largest fiscal imbalance and the highest inflation rates, joined the monetary union. The reason is that in order to meet all the convergence criteria, the most inflationary countries, say the Mediterranean countries, had to implement tighter monetary policies by rising interest rates, which by negatively affecting economic activity would have a negative impact on public debt and public deficit. The only possibility to meet the fiscal criteria was to implement several severe fiscal adjustments with the consequent negative economic and social consequences. In other words, the aim or the objective, the logic behind these figures was to discourage the countries with the greatest economic imbalances from joining the monetary union by postponing their entry to their potential or possible entry to a later point in time, beyond 1997 or 1999, once their imbalances have been corrected. It should be borne in mind that this implies that the fundamental fiscal rules prevailing in the Eurozone, prevailing nowadays in the Eurozone, are not based on a purely economic logic, but they are based on a political logic, that of determining, of setting the number of countries participating in the euro area. The signing in 1997, that is 5 years after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, of the Stability and Growth Pact, implicitly involved a reform of the Maastricht Treaty, because this pact obliged the candidate countries and the members of the euro area. Notice that the Stability and Growth Pact was approved before the European Monetary Union entered in functioning. As I say, it reformed the Maastricht Treaty because it obliged the candidate countries and later the members of the euro area to adopt a much more restrictive budgetary fiscal policy that one set out in the Maastricht Treaty. The pact defined the exceptional circumstances under which budgetary imbalances, fiscal imbalances, could not be defined as an excessive deficit, thus avoiding sanctions for excessive deficit, as well as the maximum permissible duration of such imbalances, something that was not determined in the treaty. In this sense, the Stability and Growth Pact used automatic and discretionary criteria to assess the situation of national public finances. Thus, a deficit above 3% of national GDP would not be considered as excessive if the GDP declined more than 2%. And any deficit above 3% of the GDP would be automatically considered as excessive if the real GDP growth exceeded minus 0.75%. However, if the fall in the real GDP ranged between minus 2% and minus 0.75%, the interpretation of a deficit above the reference values would be subject to a discretionary decision by the European Council. In addition, the pact stipulated that the duration of the exceptionality period had to be limited to just 1 year, irrespective of the length of the recession. In addition, the Stability and Growth Pact set as a medium-term objective for countries to achieve a budget balancing surplus or at least close to imbalance. Indeed, 8 years later, in the year 2005, the pact was reformed, obliging countries to set specific medium-term budgetary objectives. These targets are different for each euro area member or candidate state. That is mean that it is implemented, it applies to all the European Union countries, and it varies depending on the national economic budgetary position and their evolution in the medium term, and also depending on the fiscal risks associated to the sustainability of public finances, including, for instance, the prospect of demographic changes and their impact on, for instance, public pension systems. These medium-term fiscal objectives are set in structural terms, discounting the effects of the business cycle on government revenue and expenditure and one-off fiscal misses. National medium-term structural balances target can range from structural balances or surplus to a structural deficit of almost 1% of potential GDP. It should be noted that the introduction of structural balances represents a new source of uncertainty in the analysis and management of fiscal policy, given the existing problems in the estimation of potential output and potential growth rates, and obviously in the estimation of a structurally or cyclically adjusted budget balance. So it's very difficult nowadays in the European Union to know what is the true counter-cyclical or pro-cyclical stance of the fiscal policy. It must also be noted that the pact puts the emphasis on the rules governing the behavior of government deficits, leaving aside the control and any mention to the evolution of the size of public debt. It implicitly assumed that the budgetary discipline exercised by capital markets through the determination of the risk premia and the interest rate paid on public debt was to be based on the dynamics of public budgets and not on the evolution of the size of the stock of public debt, something that is a problem that was fully proved during the financial crisis. Well, although after the outbreak of the global financial crisis, that is in the years 2007 and 2009, European countries implemented expansionary fiscal policies to offset the negative impact of the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. Since the year 2010, most of these countries implemented, Euro countries implemented fiscal adjustment measures, raising taxes and mainly cutting public expenditures in order to reduce public deficit. This restrictive fiscal policy was applied during the years 2012 and 2013, when the European economy went and the Euro area economy went into a recession, thus making fiscal policy procyclical. Indeed, in order to strengthen fiscal austerity, since the year 2011, the European Union approved a set of measures that seeks in the short term to ensure that the European countries adopt the necessary budgetary measures to reduce their fiscal imbalances by bringing them closer to the limits established in the Maastricht Treaty, and in the long term to ensure that the budget balances of the Euro countries would be in a surplus position, or at least in a position close to a balanced budget. Thus, in the year 2011, for instance, it was approved the directive that is usually known as the six-pack. In the 1 year later, in 2012, it was approved that what is known as the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance in the Economic and Monetary Union, of which the Fiscal Compact is also part. And also in 2013, the two-pack was approved. That is two directives that regulate the procedure for supervising budgetary plans and the measures to adjust excessive deficits in the Eurozone countries. The implications of these provisions for fiscal policy are clearly set out in the Article 3 of the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance in the Economic and Monetary Union. According to this article, general government balances in Europe must be in balance or in surplus. Budgetary stability shall be deemed to be achieved even when a government records a deficit, provided that the structural balance complies with the medium-term objective, which may be not smaller than minus 0.5%. It also establishes that deviation from the medium-term objective or from the adjustment path towards this objective can only occur temporarily under exceptional circumstances. In sum, the fiscal rules adopted after the outbreak of the global financial crisis represent a reversal of those already established in the Maastricht Treaty and the Stability and Growth Pact. These new rules, approved 1 decade ago, further limit the possibility of discretionary fiscal measures, reducing the working of fiscal policy to the operation of automatic stabilizers. And also, it must be noted that in addition to these measures, even in this sense, there was, according to this measure, there was the obligation of, as it was also approved some years ago, for all the countries to set a medium-term budgetary objectives. It was approved the establishment of an expenditure market benchmark, that is, an expenditure rule that determines what would be the rate of growth of public expenditure, and it is linked to the growth of the potential growth rate of the economy. So, as a result of these measures, macroeconomic policy in the euro area has been, and at least until the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, in the hands only of the European Central Bank. This monetary policy has been based on cuts in the official rate, which has declined from 1.5% in July 2011 to the 0% that was set in March 2016. In addition, the ECB is resolutely applying unconventional measures, that is quantitative easing, to inject liquidity into the banking system, giving very long-term, that is up to 3 years, loans to banks, and also setting programs to purchase financial assets from banks. Therefore, since the 1 decade ago, in the year 2011, the macroeconomic policy strategy in the euro area has been defined, characterized by an expansionary monetary policy that has been combined with a restrictive fiscal policy. However, by the end of the last decade, the exhaustion of this macroeconomic policy strategy was already evident. It is true that this strategy was effective to avoid a second generalized sovereign debt crisis, and also to reduce risk premium the cost of public borrowing. And therefore, monitoring this strategy helped to avoid a situation of unsustainable fiscal balances and also to stabilize the financial system, avoiding a new generalized banking and financial crisis in Europe. However, the limitations of this strategy are no less evident. On the one hand, it was recognized the existence of a liquidity trap. Moreover, inflation rates have remained under the target of the 2%. In fact, in the year 2019, before the pandemic, the inflation rate in the euro was only 1.3%, and only even 2 tenths lower 1.1% in the euro area. On the other hand, it has not been allowed for a significant acceleration of the growth rate. And actually, in the year 2019, the European Union GDP growth was merely 1.5% and only 1.3% in the euro area. Indeed, in the year 2019, a few months at the end of the year, a few months before the outbreak of the pandemic, the European Central Bank itself recognized the need for the best fiscal performance, that is, for Germany, to adopt fiscal stimulus measures, abandoning the strategy of fiscal austerity in order to accelerate the economic activity, not only in their economies, but also at the whole euro area. At this point, and having presented the macroeconomic policy strategy in the euro area, we can question and we can make some comments about its effectiveness and its economic effects from a longer perspective. In this sense, we can analyze the performance of the euro area in terms of elements such as the economic growth, the economic stability, the dynamics of the main structural economic imbalances, the adjustment of the fiscal policy, or even the counter-cyclical stance of macroeconomic policy in the sense of negative spillovers. In any case, before making this presentation during the next 10-15 minutes, we can anticipate that the assessment of the effectiveness of the macroeconomic policy strategy in general and the fiscal policy in the euro area in particular is deeply negative. In this sense, and to start to present some data, it is clear that the process of European integration has not accelerated economic growth. As the data of the transparency show, that presents the evolution of the euro area GDP compared with the evolution of other regions, both from a longer perspective, that is from the year 1991, or since the beginning of the euro area in the year 1999, it's clear that the long-term economic performance of the euro area as measured by the GDP growth lags far behind that of developing and emerging economies and the rest of the advanced economies. And it's important to mention, including the European economies that do not belong to the euro area. And it is independent the period in which we compare the data. It's clear that European economic growth has not accelerated. On the contrary, since its creation, the rate of GDP growth in the euro area has declined, as we can see, both at the whole region as a whole, and even also in its largest members that we are presenting now, the data of the four largest euro economies: Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. The only exception would be Germany, which has remained more or less unchanged. But it's clear, as we can see for the dotted line, that there is a clear downward trend in the GDP growth rate in all the economies, showing the trend project. It is clear. I mean, I insist not only if we look at the data that it covers the last 60 years. It's clearly we can see a clear declining trend in France, Italy, or in Spain. The slowdown in the growth, in the economic growth, has been accompanied by a significant improvement in the current account balance. So in this sense, we can say that one of the objectives of the process of economic and monetary integration, and it was the rise in the intra-euro and extra-euro trade flows, has been achieved. So we can see at the for instance, at the figure of the left, it's clear that that the slowdown in growth has been accompanied by a significant improvement in the current account balance as a percentage of GDP in the euro area and as a whole, and also in in nearly all member states, perhaps with the only exception of France. And it's important, again, I repeat, that this improvement in the current account balances is taking place in a context of rising size of exports and imports. This improvement in the current account balance, which occurs, say, in the context of rising shares of export and imports in the GDP, means that the lower economic growth is explained by the lower contribution to the economic growth of private domestic spending, consumption, and investment, and also public spending. That is, this strategy of an export-led growth has not been able to achieve a higher economic growth. So in other words, we can say that the improvement in the external competitiveness of the euro area and the adoption of an export-led growth in most states and most euro countries, more euro economies, has not served to generate a high and sustainable high growth path as it was initially expected. As a result of this lower economic growth, the potential growth rate of the euro area countries, which, despite the delimitation of this concept, gives some idea about some information about what would be the long-term rate of economic growth, has plummeted. It's clear that it has plummeted in the euro area. This decline is more clearly seen in the graph on the right, which shows the potential growth rate of the four largest euro area economies since the decade of the 60s. In this sense, it must be noted that we will be talking, we'll be saying that we'll be talking about the potential growth in these four economies being below 1% in the year 2019. That is before the outbreak of the pandemic. The decline in the real and potential growth rate has also, not only has it's also generated an economic problem, it's also generating a fiscal problem, because it is generating problems of fiscal unsustainability, making the objectives related regarding the public debt and the deficit are absolutely unachievable. In this sense, at the table you can see that how to achieve the sustainable public debt close to the objective of the 60%, with the figures corresponding to the potential growth rate of GDP growth rate that corresponding to the year 2009. That is, as you can see, it's the slide is clearly well below that figure that we mentioned some slides ago. That is, remember that we were talking that the figure that make that the figures of 3% public deficit of 3% being coherent with the incompatible with the figure of the 60% of the stock of the public debt, was these figures could become coherent if only if there is a nominal rate of growth of the GDP of 5%. We are talking of a situation in which the nominal rate of growth of the GDP in most European areas is close or even below 2.5% in the main economic countries of the region. So in this sense, the deficit that could achieve the maintenance of the figures of the 60% of the public debt would be well below this figure of the 3%. Well, lower economic growth has not been accompanied by the high degree of a stronger macroeconomic stabilization that is for, and has not come with a lower volatility of euro economies. As the transparency chart shows, the volatility of the business cycle in the euro area, as proxied by the size and duration of the output gap, has not been smooth. Policy action in the euro area has been characterized by a procyclical orientation, mostly restrictive during recession. I mean, we are talking of fiscal policy, of course, as witnessed during the Great Recession in the period 2011 to 2013. It's important to note that this cyclical bias of fiscal policy in the Euro countries does not occur, at least with the same intensity, in the case of the non-Euro EU countries. So you can, or you making a proper idea, we can say, for instance, that between the years 2011 and the year 2014, around 90% of Euro countries adopted a restrictive pro-cyclical fiscal policy. These figures, this percentage in the case of the European countries, the non-Euro European countries, was around 40%. This pro-cyclical bias of the fiscal policy during recession will be a key element in understanding how the negative shock that affect the Euro area have a lasting and permanent impact on long-term growth, as well as in understanding the dimension of the structural imbalances that affect this economy, such as and obviously, it creates a problem that the lack of coordination with the monetary policy that since during the last decade has been expansionary. As we have pointed out, also one of the main consequences of the secular stagnation that characterizes the Euro area is that the main macroeconomic imbalances has not been corrected. In this respect, the persistence of the unemployment problems in the countries of the region stand out. As the graphs in the figures in the transparency in the slide show, real and structural unemployment rates, measured in the latter case by the non-accelerating wage rate of unemployment, had not fallen since the 90s, having risen in certain cases such as Italy. Germany would be the exception, but in this case it could be explained by the process of aging process that is taken in Germany. And it's important to note that these unemployment rates have not fallen over the past decade, despite the fact that most of these countries, most European countries, has implemented severe and intensive labor market reforms, precisely trying to make the labor market more flexible. And indeed, it must be noted that in many cases, this labor market reform has been approved during periods of fiscal adjustment episodes, trying to offset with these measures the negative impact on employment and unemployment of the fiscal austerity. It's also worth mentioning the fact that the government combination of fiscal austerity policies with this labor market flexibilization reform have led to a marked increase in the levels of economic inequality on poverty, and it takes place regardless what is the mix that we use. The evolution of Gini coefficient, the people at risk of poverty or social exclusion, the material social deprivation figures, the inequality and poverty data in Europe in general in the Eurozone is clearly excessive, not corresponding what would be expected in a group of developed countries. This, in part, also, this rising inequality in income distribution is mainly associated to the strategy of reducing fiscal public deficit through the combination of cutting taxes and mainly cutting social expenditures. And if we see at the data presented at the transparency, we can see that, for instance, total public expenditure has declined almost 6 points of the GDP during the last 2 decades and a half. And we can see that this decline in social in public expenditure has taken place in most, if not all, the different budgetary items, with the exception of the expenditure in public pension and health that is associated to the problem of the aging process of the European Euro economies. And contrary to what would be expected in a scenario of restrictive and fiscal austerity policies, fiscal imbalance have not been corrected in Europe, quite surprisingly. With the exception of Germany, the Euro area has systematically incurred into high government deficit, recurrently exceeding the threshold of the 3% of the GDP, as we can see in the figure corresponding to the whole Euro area or to the 4 main countries. In parallel, and it's also important, there is also an fulfilling in terms of the objective corresponding to the size of the public debt. Indeed, the size of public debt has been progressively increasing, with few exceptions, so that in 2 years ago, in 2019, the stock of public debt in the euro area exceeded 85% of the GDP. As we have argued above, behind this increase in fiscal balances is that we can find the decline in economic growth that has led to the increase in the size of public debt. And only the decline in the interest rates promoted by the expansionary monetary policy has been able to offset this rising public debt. This data clearly show that the current fiscal situation in the euro area is very far from the objective set out in the Maastricht Treaty, and of course much further from the objective set in the fiscal rules adopted in the last decade, which established that set as the objective for a budget balance to get a balanced budget close to a budget or close to the equilibrium. To conclude, as merely in 1 minute, we can say that the fiscal rules derived from the Maastricht Treaty, the Stability and Growth Pact, and the reforms to the rules approved over the past decade have had a negative impact on the economies of the euro area, slowing their growth, contributing to the performance of the maintenance of the structural imbalances, mainly in the case of unemployment, and generating additional problems like the rising economic inequality. The break on economic growth explains why, despite the generalization of fiscal austerity, fiscal imbalances in Europe and the euro area has not been corrected, increasing in particular the size of the rise of the public debt, and putting the public debt in Europe in a situation close to a situation of unsustainability or explosiveness. Although in the current context of the pandemic, fiscal policies currently being expansionary and countercyclical, this can only be seen as a transitory and exceptional situation. Although the need to reform fiscal rules in the euro area is being raised, it's not clear that there is in Europe, in the euro area, a political will to radically reform these rules. And therefore, the medium and long-term economic outlook and perspective in the euro area is far from being optimistic. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Jesus, for your interesting and broader presentation about the European fiscal policies. Well, while people are thinking about some question, I will do some points. I will begin with the end of your presentation, that you suggest that the necessity to raise the fiscal rules in the euro area. And my point is do you think that is just necessary to raise these fiscal rules, or to implement other sort of rules or other agenda to reform? In particular, the problem that you point out in your presentation is the lack of coordination between economic policies, particularly fiscal policy and monetary policies. And so this is my first question. And the second question is related to the 2008 global crisis. That, as we know, the financial crisis began in the United States, but it was much more deeper in Europe, and it seems that it was that the spread of the crisis shows exactly the lack of the instruments, counter-cycle instruments, to face crisis. For instance, as I know, your focus was on fiscal policy. All right, that is national, but also the coordination with the European Central Bank, that they are central bank did not act as lender of last resort. That is the basic role of the central bank. That seems that European euro area was not prepared to have a shock. There was no instruments how to face a big external shock. Well, so I'd like to hear you about this point, and also what you propose in terms of a new agenda for economic policies for the Europe in general.
Well, thank you very much, Luis Fernando, for your comments and questions. Well, in this sense, you are posing a lot of questions related to the significant high number of problems that is suffering the macroeconomic policy strategy in the European Union. Because in this sense, we suffer for I think you can say an original sin. It is that when you have a single monetary union, you need to have also a single fiscal policy. At least you have a federal, say a kind of federal budget that could act for the whole monetary union, that is could be identified like a country, as if we were talking of the states of the United States, of the region of the states of Brazil, and that can coordinate, what would be the evolution of the symmetric or even asymmetric evolution on the regions, the territories that form this monetary space. In Europe, does not exist such a single fiscal policy, because you must take into account that the European Union budget is quite limited. By law, it cannot exceed the size of 1.2% of the GDP of the European Union. So it's even you must take into account that even, for instance, that we are hearing all the time about the extraordinary fiscal impulse given by the recent programs in the European Union. As a whole, if you look at the current circumstances, what we say the normal European budget and the new instruments merely are equivalent to 2% of the GDP. So in the European Union, we need desperately a fiscal European Union. This is an economic problem, but it's also a political problem, because this implies that countries must transfer competencies on certain activities and on certain public expenditures, and also resources. For instance, in the form of trying to create an European, say, unemployment benefit scheme that could help to offset the shocks that can affect the whole European Union or some of the European countries. So in this sense, this is a problem that cannot be solved unless we have this federal budget. What is the problem? That the creation of this instrument requires by law the unanimous decision of all the 27 European countries, and it is difficult, and it is that is difficult to achieve. So this will be the only the problem. Of course, in the meantime, whereas if we don't have this single fiscal policy, we need to have some coordination in the fiscal policies. So in this sense, the problem that we should solve is that we should pay more attention to the public debt. We should try to avoid, as now, the situation of excessive fiscal deficit that can occur in certain countries, especially when it is not explained by the economic situation. But we have a problem that we lack of the current system is quite asymmetric. It does not allow to have high public deficit, but at the same time it allows to have high or excessive fiscal surplus. That has been the case, for instance, in countries like Germany. So in this sense, if we need a proper coordination in the national fiscal policy, we need to coordinate and to avoid generate the generation not only excessive deficit, but also we need to have rules that prohibit the generation of excessive surpluses. Because in this sense, we are talking of we can suffer the problems of the spillover from the deficit, but also we are suffering the negative impact of excessive surpluses. And in this sense, and finally, related what you're talking about the economic policy of the financial global crisis, the problem that we have in Europe is that we didn't enjoy the proper coordination that it took place, for instance, in country in the United States. You may notice that at the beginning of the crisis, while most European countries were implementing expansionary fiscal policy, until the year 2008, the ECB was implementing tight monetary policy, and indeed it raised interest rates. And the problem is that a couple of years later, when the ECB started to implement expansionary monetary policies, most of the European countries was at the same time simultaneously implementing tight, restrictive fiscal policies. So in this case, again, there is something that should be solved. That is the problem of coordination, not only among national fiscal policy, but also we need to set a proper mechanism for trying to get a better coordination with the monetary policy of the ECB.
Okay, thank you, Jesus. Is there any question in the YouTube? You can, okay. Well, just one final question, Jesus, is that you showed that the economic performance of Europe is more related to, you have this sort of case that the current account is increased in terms of GDP, but the household expenditure stagnated, something like that. And I'd like to hear you. What do you suggest in terms? Are you suggesting that increase public debts to compensate the household expenditure, or others, or implemented some redistributive income policies in order to increase household expenditure? This is my question.
Yes, well, as you say, well, it depends on the moment we are talking about, because it's obvious that nowadays, what is the engine of the growth in the economic growth in the Eurozone, which is pulling the increase in the public, and also in the public, but also in the private spending, is public spending. It's now public spending which is trying to fuel the economic growth in Europe, but it's obvious it is a situation that cannot be maintained in the time. So in this sense, we need to raise private consumption, because it's the only way to achieve a higher economic growth. What is clear is that in Europe, this export-led growth has not worked. We must take into account that initially it was a question of 2 or 3 countries that were adopting this strategy as a engine of growth. It was a situation that was focused, for instance, 2 decades ago, in the case of Germany, in the case perhaps of the Netherlands. But this is the economic growth strategy was completely different in countries like Spain, Germany, and Italy, and so on. Since the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, most, if not all, the European countries are trying to base their economic growth and the recovery in the export growth. And obviously, it is not possible that all the countries in the European Union have the possibility of adopt an effective strategy in this sense. It's not effective. At most, it can be achieved for just a few members. So in this case, we need desperately that or it could be generated, all the Euro area countries adopt or approve or decide a change in the economic strategy based in the growth of private consumption. Obviously, it will involve to adopt any different measures. It will also involve not only public stimulus. We will need also measures, for instance, to change the current income distribution, making it more equal, and also probably it will have to change the current labor market policies, trying to reduce the higher, the rising share or atypical or temporary part-time jobs that are associated to low wages and that avoid a rise in the private consumption. That they are acting as a brake to the growth in private consumption.
Okay, I think that is time to finish. For we have the next section, and okay, Jesus, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very nice to have here in our workshop, and I hope that that the post-case and conference in Bilbao return next year. I recommend. I have been there a lot of times, and I indeed recommend this conference that Jesus Ferreiros and his colleagues organized. It's very nice indeed, and so thank you. Hope to see you soon. Take care.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much to all. Bye.
Okay. Bye bye. We are having to 50 minutes of stop, and then we are returning with the presentation of Julio Costa Santos of Uberlândia Federal University, and also my own presentation. Okay? We just have a quick stop. See you soon. Hello, everybody. We are going to have our second section of today. And the first presentation will be Julio Costa Santos, Professor of Economics at the Federal University of Uberlândia. Welcome, Julio.
Welcome. Hi, Luis. Hi, Luis Fernando. How are you?
Yeah, fine, thank you. And the paper that Julio will present is there. I think that there is some paper involved, right? A stock flow consistent as a suitable approach to modeling the new developmentalist framework. So, and after that, Orero asked me to do a small presentation that will be related to the subject, two asymmetries in emergent economies, productive and financial ones. Julio, is your word, please.
Thank you, Luis Fernando. Nice to meet you here. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I want to thank Orero, Marvil, Luis Fernando, and all other colleagues that invite me to give this presentation, which is entitled as Stock and Flow Consistent as a Suitable Approach to Modeling the New Developmentalist Framework. Okay. As Luis Fernando said, my name is Julio Fernando Costa Santos. I am professor in the field of economics in Uberlândia Federal University in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil. And I am suspicious to say, but I spend a lot of time of my research modeling and using SFC models. And today, this is the main subject that I'm going to present here. Okay. Given the time, we have a very short time to present the core ideas of new developmentalist school of thought. I will give very briefly a summary of the basic theoretical propositions. And I know Orero on Friday also did in a deep way. So I will spend much less time than he did. But I need to remember some main points that will drive our presentation here, okay? So the first point is the economic development is a cumulative process of raising real wages and living standards. So we have an increase in the labor productivity that comes from the structural change and the technological progress. The second point is the output growth rate is determined by the non-capacity creating autonomous demand. Since we are thinking in small open economies, the only sustainable variable is exports in the long run, okay? Because we are dealing here with a model that tries to analyze the long run features of by what was proposed by Bresser and other co-authors, okay? The third point is the long-run growth cannot be supply-side determined because capital accumulation, the workforce, and the labor productivity will adjust to the non-capacity creating autonomous demand. So it also cannot be balance of payments constrained because the foreign trade income elasticities are not constant during the process of structural change. So this could be formalized as this dynamic equation, which we can say that the time derivative of the ratio between the income elasticities are different from zero, while t is less than the t compatible with the steady state, okay? More than that, I can say if we are going to increase the manufacturing share, this is also have a positive sign in this differential equation, okay? So another point is that more complex productive structures will have a higher ratio between the income elasticity of exports and imports, and this will relaxing the BOP growth rate constraint. So this is the main point. Since we are dealing with structural change, we can look to the idea of the growth rate constraint proposed by Thurl as being a relaxed one in the long run. Okay, so the point 4 is in the case of the economies with abundant natural resource. Long-run growth is constrained by a chronic tendency of exchange rate overvaluation that stems from first a Dutch disease, and the second for the foreign high capital inflows. Such an overvaluation interrupts and reverses the process of productivity sophistication, being the main cause of the middle income trap in development countries. The point 5, domestic savings and external savings are substitutes rather than complements. Aggregate savings are determined by investment. Here we are using the traditional Keynesian view, okay? But its composition depends on the level of real exchange rates. So an appreciation of exchange rates increase the weight share as markups over unit costs fall. And given that the propensity to save out of the profits is greater than the out of wages, an increase in external savings due to an appreciation of exchange rates is associated with a reduction in domestic savings. The point 6 is that the abundance of natural resources make the industrial equilibrium exchange rate to be greater than the exchange rate compatible with the balanced current account. In this way, the long-term sustainability of the economic growth in countries with abundant natural resources requires that they have a surplus in the current account. The last but not least, the point 7, the adoption of external rate savings growth strategy is another source of the real exchange rate overvaluation. So growth with external savings requires to the policymakers to set the domestic interest rate at a level higher than the sum between international interest rate plus the counter risk premium, and this interest rate differential induced to a foreign capital inflows, resulting in a surplus in the balance of payments capital accounts and a real exchange rate appreciation relative to the level of the current account balance. This is the main propositions. This is the core of the new developmentalist ideas. So today, this in the next slides, I'm going to talk in a very briefly way about the paper that was developed by Oreiro da Silva and Davila Fernandes that was published in Structural Change and Economic Dynamics in 2020. This is a very important paper that I will call as a seminal paper because it's this first effort trying to formalize the core ideas into a macrodynamic model. So here I took the freedom to represent the model as this flow charts using some nodes to capture the main idea. Okay, so we have the main variable here to be drive is the real exchange rate. I don't know if you can see very clear in this presentation, but I'm just talk about the how it works. Okay, so here we have the real exchange rate is as a main variable to be managed, controlled by the policymakers, and it is influenced by the Dutch disease and also by the capital inflows. Here we are putting the condition that is linked to the real exchange rate. So the policymakers enter here trying to control real exchange rates, and this real exchange rate will affect the capitalist markup. Affecting the capitalist markup is also a variable that could influence in the conflict claims that could lead to the inflation. So since we can have the managing of real exchange rates, I also could affect the conflict claims that will lead to inflation in the model. So another point is that by managing the real exchange rate, I can reduce the technological gap by inducing the process of capital accumulation. Since we have the growth rate of capital accumulation higher than the aggregate demand, or the growth rate of the labor force, I can say that I am in the process of buying new machines and new equipment, and this is bringing to us some new technologies, and this is trying to reduce the technological gap. Okay, this is one point. Another point is that by managing the real exchange rate, we can try to increase the manufacturing industrial share in this GDP, and this is an important variable because it could accelerate the growth rate of exports, which is going to interact with dynamic multiplier, and this could create a cycle, a positive cycle between the dynamic multiplier, capacity utilization, capital accumulation, technological gap reduction, and the model will work basically in this the main ideas that I'm saying. So another point to mention is that by increasing the industrial share in the GDP, we can increase the labor productivity, and this will allow us to increase the real wages, and without coming to more inflation inside the model. So basically, the model has these channels to operate. Of course, I'm not saying all the channels that the model works, because it's I don't know right now if 33 or 36 dynamic equations, but this is a very briefly way to talk about that. Okay, now I'm going to mention some advantages of this model, what I will call as OSD's model, to mention Oreiro, Silva, and Davila Fernandes. The first point is the first efforts to formalize into a system of ordinary differential equations. This is a big step to the new developmentalist school of thought. Another point is that in the end of the paper, the authors reduced the model into a 3D system, a three-dimensional system, which could be allow us to have analytic analysis, which give us the steady-state values, the partial derivative signal, local stability, and another features that is very elegant from the mathematical point of view. Okay, more than that, it gave us a benchmark. So I think all other papers that will try to model the way that works the new developmentalist will need to be linked to this benchmark in some way. Okay, and it can be easily changed to incorporate other macroeconomic channels. So I think this contribution made by Oreiro, Silva, and Davilas is a big step in this school of thought. But I'm not going to criticize, but I need to impose some limitations from the perspective of the stock and flow consistent modeling, right? So here I'm going to mention some limitations. So the short-run view is not considering in the model. I know the reason. The reason is because the model is a long-run model, and they could disconsider the short-run dynamic to the long run. But in the literature of the stock and flow consistent, we have many links from the short run that could give impact on the long run features of the model. Okay, this is important to mention. There is no role for money. It's not a problem of the model proposed by them, but it's a problem of the most of post-Keynesian macrodynamic models, okay? Some black and holes could emerge. Just to mention one, it's a very regular way to model in the post-Keynesian view, say something about the savings, but not about the wealth, okay? But we can think in savings as a flow and the wealth as a stock. And this could be linked to the way that loans will appear in a complete model, and this has impact in investment decisions and other variables that could be very important to the long run properties of the model. Okay. Another point about this first model, we have no financial or banking activities, and for the literature of stock and flow consistent, this is very important and could be to the dynamic of the model, since we can change the way that the investment decision are being made and how the finance of investment works. We can put inside the model the cycle of finance, investment, savings, and funding. Okay, this is a very important subject in the post-Keynesian school. Okay, another simplified assumption that the policymakers could control the real exchange rate as an active rule. Okay, but I think this could be more difficult than when you can think, but and we need to put some noise and some mess inside that to trying to look in details how these rules could be work. Okay, there is no link between profit and wage shares in the capacity utilization. This is important because if we are saying that changing the profit and wage shares going to increase the propensity to save, we have also impact in the capacity utilization, which is considered in the first version of the paper, and we can't put this in a stock and flow consistent version. So this alternative view is to create a stock and flow consistent modeling, right? A very briefly introduction. This is, of course, not a course of stock and flow consistent modeling, but just to mention, over the last decade, stock and flow consistent modeling has become the most prominent approach in the school of macroeconomic heterodox models. This approach has already proven to be quite successful, formulate complex interactions between financial sphere and the production side of the economy. The SFC approach has its origins in the works of James Tobin, who came from the Yale's World School, and the Cambridge Economic Policy Group, directed by Will Godley. The first is the mentor of rigorousness of the SFC models, and the second one was the pioneer of using the approach to assess the structure of American and British economy in the 70s and the 80s. Continue that. Until now, most of the papers use SFC approach are related to the theoretical issues that come from the post-Keynesian literature. In part, the reason is explained by the fact of SFC's models are characterized by the high flexibility that allows them to use for investigate the wide spectrum of topics. Here we have some examples. We have the first paper from Cláudio Milton dos Santos, who wrote a paper exploring the idea of SFCs as an explored frontier. We have this paper from dos Santos and Zeza that create a simplified benchmark model to growth rates using a Kalekian approach. Okay, this is a very important paper to this literature, trying to link the Kalekian literature into the SFC models. And we have another advances that comes from Fontana and Passarella that model the Marshall-Lerner condition within SFC models. Kayani 2016 that create a macro foundations inside SFC models to give us a benchmark to follow. Okay, there is also research being done in empirical SFC models. This is a very important point to mention, because in the mainstream nowadays we have the big discussion being done in terms of dynamic stochastic DSGE models. Okay, and I think the most prominent alternative by the heterodox frontier comes from the SFC models. So, and by that, we have some efforts being done by different authors trying to modeling England, giving us guidelines to build Italy, Argentina, Greece, Denmark, and Mexico. The problem about these papers is most of them is still in the work papers version, not peer reviewed, and so is still a frontier to be advanced. Okay, so about the pros, we have the integration of balance sheets, transaction flows. We can track the money, the assets, and liabilities. We can also integrate the short run and the long run into the Keynesian perspective. Okay, there is no need to model the equations for the sake of the mathematical analytical analysis. So we don't need to reduce the model into a 3D version or a 4D version because the analytical analysis could be so hard to do with OD system with higher dimension. But here in this literature, we don't have this special need. Okay, we can use modern econometric tools to trying to calibrate the model, such as Bayesian estimation and other time series techniques. We can perform sensitivity analysis to give a shock and try to understand how the model will work. Okay. Also, we can design experiments of short-run fluctuations, such as fiscal or monetary shocks, and after that is examine the convergence to the long-run policies or to long-run trends that we mentioned here in the new developmentalist proposal. Okay, some cons is less formal in the mathematical perspective. Okay, so less answers from the mathematical point of view could be given. We still have problems with Lucas' critique. Okay, because the main critique of Lucas is still living inside the models that don't use macro foundations, but some kind of answer has been made from the perspective of putting inside these models the agent-based models, the agent-based approach. So we are trying to fix it, okay, in some way, and sometimes could be a very hard to deal with because modeling, estimating, and other efforts. So it's a hard task. Okay, so if we choose a macro-founded version using agent-based models, what we call here as ABM, we may need to deal with complexity because it's one kind of feature that comes from agent-based. Is a kind of a trade-off that we lost the power to forecast, given complexity inside the model. So this is a further discussion that could be made. Okay, some questions that could be answered using SFC. How the financial sector and the banking activities could change the model's dynamic. This is a very important question to us. Another point: could the fiscal policy be neutral, as been proposed by the seminal paper? In the SFC literature, we have some answers, such as proposed by Leheron in 2012, saying that is not what we usually know about the longer run, and disconsidering the interactions of the fiscal policy in the short run. So I think this opened a new agenda, a new avenue to explore the short run interactions between fiscal policy and monetary policy and the model properties. Okay, so another sub-points, we have the twin perspective deficits. This is a very common in this literature. There is a link. There is a need to link the government expenditures to the accumulation of foreign high reserves. Caio Masi, in this master's dissertation 2013, gives some answer about that. And should the fiscal policy be pro or anti-cyclical? Also, Godley and Lavoie already give us some answers about long run. So we can explore deeply the impact of the real exchange rate on the firm's unit costs. We can model insert import as an intermediate inputs. This is a very important, because since we are trying to devaluate in the real exchange rate, we have impacts over the markup, but we also have a cost impact over the intermediate inputs. So we can analyze this in more details. So we also have impact in markup. We can impact the capitalist investment decisions. And another point is that we are disconsidering the whole made by the interest rate to control the aggregate demand. And here we can put inside model, because we know in models like has been made by the seminal paper of Hawthorne, we can use the interest rate to control the capacity utilization, and we can manage the conflict claims. So this is an important thing to put inside the model. Another point, how the real interest rate decisions could, as a monetary rule, impact the dynamic. We can also have impacts on affect capital cost. We can increase the financial cost. We can also try to investigate, since we are dealing with development in economies. Most of them are using inflation target regime. So is be compatible using inflation target regime and try to put some rule in the real exchange rate? Do you need to fix? Do we need to fix the real exchange rate, the inflation target regime, to incorporate this kind of rule? This is a question that must be made. Okay, how much effort must be made to control the financial capital account in BOP? This is another question important, another important question, because I think control the financial capital is not a variable, a dummy variable like 0 or 1. We can create levels between how open we are to them. Okay, and this could be tested inside this kind of modeling. Okay, we have some new papers that are still open the new agenda to the stock and flow consistent. We have Nalin and Yahima 2020 giving macroeconomic implication of using commodity-linked notes to development countries. This is an important issue to development countries, since they are very linked to the commodity cycle. In the paper, they just give a link to the financial system, but we can also create a multi-sectoral economy that has a part linked to the commodity cycle and another part linked to the manufacture policy. So we can interact with them and just look how the things work inside the model. Okay. Some links between fiscal policy, labor productivity, and open economy, made by Carnevale in 2020. And this is our contribution, made by me and Oreiro in 2020. We try to analyze the interest, the long-run interest rate and the investment decision in a post-Keynesian perspective point of view. Okay, so I try to accelerate so much this presentation. So I finish here. If you want to know more about me, I have my personal site here, just in Portuguese only. I apologize for that. I think I will translate it, but right now it's just the Portuguese version is still online. So thank you so much. And again, thank you all the colleagues that make it possible. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me see what is, oh, there is, oh, thank you so much, Julio. I don't know what is going to, okay, that's it. There is some strange in my camera. I don't know what's going on. Let me see. Oh, thank you, Julio. It was very nice presentation, very interesting work. Well, Orero asked me to present some talk, and I will briefly present my. Let me present my. Let's see if I can. And okay, no, that is just 1 minute to.
Okay, no problem. Take your time.
I don't know. I don't know what's going on that I cannot introduce my. Let's see if.
You want to share the screen, Luis?
Yeah, yes, I want to share the screen exactly. But when when I select share the screen, only. I don't know what is. No, there is only your photo of Julio and let me see.
If you want, you can send me, and I can share my screen using your presentation. If you like.
Okay. Send me. Let me send your email here.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on. Don't know why. Julio, okay. Just hold on. Compartilhe a tela. Okay, but Julio Costa.
Daniel, I think the problem is the icon in the screen of Luis Fernando, right? So we cannot click.
Let me have a look. I was trying, but let me have a look. If what's going on. I send to you, but I will
Okay.
try again. I will try again. Well, I just select share, compartilhar, and but I don't know why my slide is not.
Luis, did you send the email?
Yeah, I sent it. Have you received it? Not yet.
Until now, not.
Okay, let me have a look. Okay. Let me do another thing. I think that is very.
I will give a second email.
No, it's that the problem is that he is very heavy and.
Okay.
Okay, I will send you in PDF.
Okay.
Let me see. Okay, now it was, but even though,
oh, I received it.
yeah,
I'm downloading, open, and I'm going to share.
thank you. I don't know why it is not what is.
Technical issues sometimes happen.
Yeah, I am trying to share my PDF slides also, but they appear and disappear.
Okay, here it is.
Yes. Just put in full screen, please.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Julio. And my presentation will be a brief talk about the two asymmetries in emergent economies, that is productive asymmetry and financial asymmetry in what I am calling a structuralist approach, Latin American structuralist approach of these both asymmetries, please. Actually, we have two asymmetries according to the Latin American structuralist approach. The old CEPAL, as Orero showed in his presentation, is very related to the productive asymmetry. That is the asymmetry in the productive structure between center and periphery, more or less diversified, which leads to international trade and equal appropriation of productive gains between the center and the periphery. This is very related to the deterioration of the terms of the trade that was first showed by Raul Prebisch in 1949. But also there is the financial asymmetry that is related to the asymmetrical international financial integration of peripheral emergent economy, subject to the instabilities of the international liquidity cycle. That is the boom and bust cycles of capital flows determined mainly by the external factor. There is a lot of studies that show that external factors are more important than domestic factors to the determination of the capital inflows to emergent economies. So I will try to show that these two asymmetries, productive asymmetry and financial asymmetry, are not only interconnected, but they are the two sides of the same coin. Please, Julio. Peripheral emergent economies have different degrees of financial subordination. I'm working with this concept of financial subordination, which depends on the form of international financial integration and also the type of the productive structure of each economy, greater or lesser diversification of the productive structure. In particular, commodity export economies, such as Latin American ones, have an economy that is not very diversified and complex, with low incorporation of technical progress. And they used to have strong dependence on capital, foreign capital, and also a very volatile current account balance that is very dependent on the commodity cycle, as I will show in the sequence. In turn, emergent East Asia economies are diversified exporters of manufacturing products with high added value, which allows them to have a strong position in their balance of payments, current account surplus, less dependence on capital inflows, and finally, a strong accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. So I will show that this is a very different way of the integration in the international economy, both in terms of trade and also in terms of financial issues. Please. Well, let me introduce briefly this concept of financial subordination. It's not very precise concept that is related to one of the characteristics of financial globalization process is the increase of capital flows between countries and of international and domestic investors involved in local and offshore markets. It's stimulated mainly by the financial liberalization process that began in post-Bretton Woods period since the 70s. In this context, international financial integration has shaped the phenomenon of financialization of peripheral emergent economy, which has one of its main features, the phenomenon called, there are different concepts, similar concepts indeed. Subordinate financialization, subordinate financial integration, or simply financial subordination. I will work with this more simple concept of financial subordination. Such concepts are related to the subordinated and dependent way in which peripheral emergent economies are integrated internationally, given the pro-cyclical and stable nature of capital flows, subject to boom and bust cycles that are strongly determined by exogenous factors, such as the Federal Reserve monetary policy, which generates macroeconomic instability in the periphery and reduces its policy space. Next, please. Some consequence of the financial, there are a lot of consequences indeed of the financial subordination. I will just point out some of them. The first is that due to the high degree of financial integration, dependence on foreign capital, the periphery promotes further increase in interest rates to compensate lower liquidity premium of their currencies. They also have much volatile exchange rates compared to advanced economies. This is what the empirical works show us. And also they accumulate foreign reserves as a cushion of safety related to the need to protection to face high volatility of capital flows and consequent abrupt movements in the exchange rate. However, the accumulation of reserves has high social costs, as due to reserves receive low remuneration compared to the high interest paid on domestic instruments. It was stressed by Danny Hodrick in a paper of 2006. And finally, emergent economies borrow in hard currency, mainly dollar, euro, and consequently take the exchange rate risk to attract international investors since they are considered a place of uncertainty and high volatility. Next, please. And here we can see the difference between, this is just the policy rates, interest rates defined by the central bank, and the red lines are of emergent economies, and the black one is of advanced economies. It's just to have a general picture that we can see that interest rates of emergent market economies is much higher than of advanced economies. That seems, this is very related to the fact of their currency has a low liquidity premium compared to the advanced economies. Currencies, mainly in the case of the United States, you have to compensate the low liquidity premium with high interest rates. This is one of the reasons. Please. And we are, well, as I mentioned, we have two asymmetries: productive asymmetry and financial asymmetry. Productive asymmetry is very related to one of what we call, how Brebesch call it, the deterioration of the terms of trade between manufacturing goods producers and commodities goods producers. We know very well this. But also there is the important concept of structural heterogeneity that was developed by Aníbal Pinto, also former secretary of CEPAL, that shows that modern and high productivity sectors, export activities mainly, in Latin American countries, absorb a small proportion of works, while the rest of the economy, featured by low productivity sectors, absorb a much large proportion for works. So you have this sort of dual economy, with one part with high productivity and another part with low productivity. Structural heterogeneity is a characteristic of Latin American economies, while East Asian economies have a much more diversified productive structure with higher level of productive and sophistication. In particular, structural change has been a feature of East Asian economies during the catch-up period, while since the 90s, we have seen a premature disindustrialization in Latin American economies. Well, one of the points that I would like to point out is that we cannot consider emergent market economies as the same. There you have, depends on the specialization of the productive structure, and also how these economies are integrated to the international financial structure. So we have, I will try to compare in my presentation these two sort of the economy that is Latin American, specialized in commodity exports, and on the other hand, East Asian economies that have a more diversified productive structure, and they export mainly manufacturing goods with high aggregate value. Please, Julio. Well, there is a very interesting recent paper of Accuse that shows that there is a connection between commodity booms and capital flows boom. In particular, peripheral commodity specialized economies in commodity and financial cycles tend to move together and reinforce each other. Commodity prices and capital inflows have a strong influence to each other, according to Accuse. Rising international commodity prices stimulate capital inflows to emergent market economies, while increase in capital inflows tends to rise the demand for commodities and commodity price. And there is the opposite when you have a falling in the international price that stimulate capital inflows, that decline capital inflows, and so on, right? So you have these two cycles, commodity cycles and liquidity cycles, are connected in the case of the commodity specialized economies. Please. Well, we just to show some, I'm using the economic complexity index, that is a measure of the degree of complexity of each country, that is in the website of Hausman and others that calculate this index. We can see very different degree of complexity between Latin America and the left and Asian economies on the right. As we can see, during the 60s and 70s, there is an increase in the case, in the index in Latin American countries, and stagnates or even decline, with exception of the Mexico, because of the maquiladoras, that is industrial oriented to United States markets. But in most cases, or stagnated since the 90s, or declining in Latin America economies. In the case of Asian economies, it's completely different picture. That is, you have a gradual increase in the index in all the countries. In case of China, that is more recently, it's more since the half of the 80s that begin the gradual transition of the economy, and began the catching up process of China. So, but in all the countries, you have this clear trend of the increase in the complexity of the economy. Please, Julio. And also, when you have a look, it's also from the Hausmann website, they calculate also the export components of each country. This case, 2019. I just select some countries, that is for Latin America, Argentina and Brazil. Argentina on the left, Brazil on the right. And we can see that clearly the specialization in the commodities. In case of the Argentina, more related to agricultural goods, mainly corn, soybeans, meat. And in case of Brazil, you have this mix between natural resources, as the case of petroleum, iron, but also agricultural goods. But in the Brazil is more more somehow, I would say, interesting case that there was a huge change in the composition of the export in the last 20 years. That you have the predominance 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the predominance of manufacturing goods. And since then, you have a huge change in the export composition. Case of Brazil, that is what some specialists call reprimarization of the exports. Please. And when we have a look in the case of China and South Korea, we have a completely different picture. That's this. Blue are manufacturing, blue. In the case of China, in the left, there is an enormous diversification of the export, enormous diversification of export. And it's just the opposite of case of Brazil. That's if you have a look in the exports of the composition of exports of China 20 years ago, you will see the low aggregate value manufacturing goods, the prevalence, and nowadays you have a different off-seam machine parts, integrated circuits, cars. You have a different products here nowadays, and of course the case of South Korea also integrated circuits, telephones, cars, vehicles, parts, and so on. So very much more diversified composition of export. Please, Julio. And of course, there is difference when we look at the current account balance of payments of the two, the left Latin American, right Asian, some Asian economies, we have a very different picture. In the case of Latin American, mainly we can see during the second half of the 90s and 2000s, and then you have this boom of commodities. After that, we have a decline in this boom of commodities, and recently, it's not here in this figure, you have again some sort of commodities boom. So it's more. So first, we can see that in most cases they are negative current account balance. Mostly, and very volatile, very dependent of the commodities moves. But when you see the Asian economies current account, we can see that not only increased for most economies in the 80s and the 90s, and also that they are positive. More than 0% of GDP for all the economies, that is Singapore, Thailand, Korea, China, and Malaysia. So you have a very different picture in terms of the trade of the two regions. Please, Julio. And also, because of the more strong position in terms of current account balance of payment, Asia economies have much higher foreign reserve as percentage of GDP compared to Latin American economies. As we can see in this figure, Malaysia, the China, that is the green, South Korea, blue, clear blue, and so on. In the case of the Latin American, you have a much lesser ratio of foreign reserve as percentage of GDP, although after the 2000 there is some increase, most in case of Mexico and Brazil. Please. Well, let me focus to finish my presentation, the financial asymmetry that one of more important economists that has, structuralist economists that has studied this problem is José Ocampo, that was former General Secretary of CEPAL as well. And Ocampo showed there is not only this central periphery in terms of trade, but also there is this central periphery relationship also between the capital flows, financial issues. So, well, let me focus on the capital account shocks have assumed the dominant role as part of a broader context of international financial stability characterized by frequent financial and currency crises. In Ocampo words, the central economies, particularly the largest amongst them, are business cycle makers, while the development countries, the periphery, are business cycle takers. So there's difference in terms of policy space. This implies different degrees of policy autonomy, whereas the center has more policy autonomy and is thus policy making, the periphery is essentially policy taking. So there is an even relationship between center and periphery, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of finance. And more important, financial asymmetry exacerbates an equal development process between center and the periphery. Please, Julio. And I will show, just to show some figures, final figures, is related to the capital flows that will begin to show the external liability of some selected countries of Latin America and East Asia, left Latin American, right East Asia. In terms of external liability, we can see, of course, in both cases, much more diversified composition of capital flows in terms of the external liabilities. But in case of Latin America, there is the predominance. First, other investments. Second, foreign direct investment. In case of the East Asia economies, we have clear, this is the orange, the predominance of FDI. That is and also there is another point that I would like to stress. Look, that's this is external liability over GDP, right? We are seeing that in case of Latin America is more than 8% of GDP of external liabilities. When you have a look in the Asian East Asia economy, we are seeing that is more than is between 50% and 40% and 50% of GDP. Much lesser dependence on capital flows. Asia vis-a-vis Latin America, right? Please, Julio. But now we are seeing the same picture, but in this case, it's net financial asset. Net financial assets means foreign assets less external liabilities. It is net financial. We can see that the only, in case of Latin America, mainly the only positive figure in terms of net financial assets are foreign reserves, foreign exchange reserve. That is this blue, dark blue here. That is the same more or less in the case of in the East Asia countries. But we can see two big differences between the two regions. The first is the fact that net financial assets balance, that is this green line, is negative in terms of GDP for Latin America. And since 2002, become positive for Asian economies. Why? Because of this difference in terms of Asian economies. The difference is because of the reserve accumulation. Mainly the fact that Asian has a much lower external liabilities and much higher foreign reserves. This is explaining why it became positive in case of Asia. But in the case of Latin America, you have just the opposite picture, because external liabilities is much higher than external assets. Second, is the fact that it's clear the much more dependence of Latin America to other investments. And the case of Asia is mostly FDI. That is, of course, is much more stable and benefits for growth than the other sort of capital flow. So you have this different picture. Please, Julio. And finally, this I took this table from another accused work, that we are including all the major emergent economy markets and all major advanced economies. It's just his estimatives about yields, returns, yields, and capital gains and loss of emergent economies and advanced economies. And we can see that yields are gross assets, yields on gross assets, the difference between gross assets and gross liabilities, and capital gains and loss result from change in assets price and exchange rates. Just to look, the more important on the right is you can see the total returns, that is the difference, the sum of the two other columns, is we can see that we have, in case of the emergent markets, the difference of the total returns is very negative. In the period 2000 to 2006, less 5.3%. In the case of the advanced economies, you have a positive returns of 1.6%. So this suggests that you have flux of return from the periphery to the advanced economy, from the periphery to the center economies in the connection of the international issues. Please. Just to conclude this, my presentation, first, productive and financial asymmetries are related to each other. They are two sides of the same coin. Emergent economies with low complexity productive structure, commodity exporters, as the Latin American ones, tend to be much more volatile economies. That is, more subject to the boom and bust of the commodity cycle and also of the liquidity cycle. And therefore, more financially subordinated than those emergent economies with much more complex productive structures and exporters of manufactured goods. The latter consisted of Asian economies with greater economic dynamism, tend to have current account surplus and high level of foreign reserves, and attracts mainly foreign direct investments as the main foreign capital, which provides then a much more robust external position compared to Latin America. So just to finish, what I try to do, that you have these two asymmetries, productive and financial asymmetry, that they are connected. Second, that there is huge difference between the commodity exporter specialized in commodities as Latin America and much more diversified economies, particularly East Asian economies that are mainly manufacturing exporters. That's all. Thank you so much for your attention. And this is what the papers, there are a lot of, this is a lot of papers that I have written with Barbara Fritz and Daniela Prats. And also there is two recent papers. That one, this is the metamorphosis of external vulnerability from original sin to original sin with Barbara and Daniela, and also with, I wrote recently a paper with two PhD students of the Institute of Economics of Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. That is this paper, Financial Subordination of Peripheral Emergent Economies, a Keynesian Structuralist Approach. Okay, that's all. We have 5 minutes. We are going to non-stop for the other section, so we can if there is some question for Julio, mainly for Julio, and for me, eventually we can answer here. Julio, are you seeing the YouTube?
Yes. To me, it's a little bit complicated because I have a two small children in my house. So yesterday and Friday, I need to share with my wife the time to look into the seminars and stay with my sons. So it's a little bit difficult, but at night I enter in YouTube and I watch most of the presentations.
Yeah, okay. It was really, yes. I know, but of course it's you have to take care of them, and you have to divide it. It's a good time to do this. And there was very interesting discussions. Of presentation, and they are you can see on the other attendance in the YouTube. All the presentation are there for one that you would like to see.
Sorry for the time. I spent much more than I expected.
No, that was nice. It was nice. It was nice. It was very nice. It was very nice. And so we are beginning. Okay, we are. We are going to have. Okay, we have 5 minutes of stop. We go back with Chandni Diwar casing in just to have time to test the microphone, the camera, the slides, and whatever.
Right.
Okay? 5 minutes stop, please.
Okay.
Okay, hello to everybody. We are now having our last section, graduate section indeed. And we have a pleasure to have here with us, sorry for my pronunciation.
That's okay, don't worry.
And Diwar Casey, PhD student at University of Siena. Chandini, welcome to our workshop, and please have the word.
Okay, we'll share the screen now. Well, it's already sharing, but I will open the presentation. Let me know when you see it. Do you see the presentation? Just check the chat. Okay, so it was working. Okay, so I can begin, right? Okay. So good afternoon or good evening to everybody who is joining. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present at this first international workshop of the Structuralist and Development Macroeconomics Research Group. As Luis was saying, I'm actually a recently graduated PhD student from the Universities of Florence, Pisa, and Siena. And now I'm working on a project called Equation, in which I'm focused on the societal barriers for the ecological transition, but in a European context. My research in the dissertation, however, was a bit more theoretical, and it was focused on the formal representation of economy-ecology configurations in the field of economics, but more specifically ecological economics. And what I want to present today is a very condensed and short version of the last chapter of my dissertation, in which I try to present a very simple theoretical framework as an alternative to the status quo right now, in which I try to capture this concept of the ecological surplus. It's a work in progress. It's not a finalized paper or anything, so any feedback or comments will be more than appreciated. So in the presentation, this is the outline. First, I'm going to introduce the status quo of formal abstraction in the field of environmental and resource economics and ecological economics. Then I will talk and introduce very shortly and briefly ecological Marxism, which is the field from which I draw this concept of the ecological surplus. Then I will introduce the baseline neo-Ricardian framework, which is the framework that I adapt in order to represent some eco-Marxist insights concerning economy-ecology configurations. These adaptations that I introduced are based on the measure of labor intensity and a formulation of a metabolic parameter, which is my own formulation. And then I will just discuss the result of these adaptations in a very, very simple comparative statics exercise. And then I will conclude and share some thoughts on what I think are some open issues and future further considerations that I need to make. So the present in the field of ecological economics, or in economics, the disruption or the degradation of ecological processes is usually treated as an externality, as many of you are familiar with, which is characterized as the unintended impact of production decisions or the organization of production on the level of production itself, on profits or some kind of social welfare. And these externalities imply reductions in economic efficiency. And since the externality is absent from any form of compensation or payment, there is a necessity to internalize these negative externalities. Internalizing these negative externalities will incentivize reorganization of production, reduction in production levels, or investment in technologies which decouple production from its negative impact on ecological degradation. And the internalization of this externality can take various shapes. It can be through the assignment of property rights following Costa's theorem, or introducing taxation or subsidy schemes or tradable permit schemes. Now, ideally, each of these internalization mechanisms will lead to a situation of economic efficiency or allocative efficiency, where ecological degradation or the level thereof is reduced to a Pareto optimal level in which producers are absent of any incentive to deviate from this level. And so usually these internalization mechanisms require the monetary valuation or estimation of relevant ecological processes, and assuming that such an estimation can be achieved and that it is more or less correct, we can formally represent this internalization mechanism as follows. So we have a production process which only considers human-made capital and labor and results in an output and W1. And then after internalization, now natural capital, which represents a resource or ecological process, is taken into account in production and results in an output plus W2. And the idea of internalizing the externality is that, of course, W2 is lower than W1, where W can denote a waste stream, a measure of scarcity of a natural resource, or any other negative impact on an ecological process. Now, this brings us to the dominant abstraction of economy ecology configurations in both environmental and resource economics and ecological economics, where a natural resource stock or an ecological process is represented by natural capital, which enters a production function. And the difference between environmental and resource economics and ecological economics regards the degree of substitutability between human-made capital and natural capital. Where environmental and resource economics abides by this weak sustainability paradigm, which means that they impose substitutability, ecological economics usually abides by the strong sustainability paradigm, which means they impose a limited substitutability and sometimes even complementarity between human-made capital and natural capital. So the leading question in my dissertation was whether I could translate some insights from non-economic fields, such as ecological Marxism, which is more rooted in social sciences, if these insights can be used to come up with a different abstraction process, different from representing ecological processes as those which enter the production function. Now, very briefly, ecological Marxism is a stream of literature which tries to highlight Marx's ecological critique of capitalism, and this is visible in many of his writings on capitalist agriculture, human-nature relationships, and the labor process. And the scholars in the ecological Marxist tradition have predominantly highlighted Marx's assessment of the structural changes in agriculture during the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, in which Marx identified a rupture in the return of the nutrients to the soil due to, on the one hand, the increasing distance between town and country, and on the other hand, the increased reliance of capitalist agriculture on capital investments for the purpose of increasing agricultural productivity. These capital investments are the use of artificial nutrients or fertilizers, which in the long run have led to soil exhaustion. Now, this idea of a rupture in a previously existing metabolism between society and nature has been coined by ecological Marxists as the metabolic rift, and contemporary scholars have then applied this theoretical lens or this concept of the metabolic rift to many contemporary ecological degradations at the hand of the capitalist mode of production. Now, it's important to bear in mind that in the rest of my presentation, I closely follow Marx's original treatment of this metabolic rift in the sphere of agricultural production. Then I will introduce now world ecology, which is a more recent strand of eco-Marxist thought. And it's different from the plain metabolic rift school in that it situates these metabolic rifts not in Great Britain and during the Industrial Revolution, but over a broader historical time period all the way to the 16th century. And it's actually kind of a synthesis between this plain metabolic rift theory and Wallerstein's world system theory. And in doing so, in tracing these ecological disruptions all the way to the 16th century, this is the lead world ecologist at the moment, introduces this theoretical concept called ecological surplus as a way to assess the state of increasing returns or conditions for sustained capital accumulation. This theoretical concept of the ecological surplus is a ratio between the appropriated and the capitalized contributors to production processes, where appropriated contributors are the non-monetized social and ecological reproduction processes, such as domestic work, care work, carbon sink capacity, soil fertility, etc. And the capitalized contributors are what we usually call monetized factors of production, such as wage labor, raw materials, machinery, paid services, etc. So I found the ecological surplus to be a very interesting concept because it accentuates the relevance of appropriated and thus non-monetized contributors to the production process. And it allowed me to kind of interpret the current abstraction process in both environmental and resource economics and ecological economics as one which is restricted to the assessment of capitalized ecological entities, or when monetary valuation has not taken place yet, this kind of formal abstraction proposes capitalization. This is my interpretation. So in other words, there is no regard for the contribution of appropriated ecological processes to production and the conditions for sustained accumulation. So then the question becomes, how can one formalize the contribution of appropriated ecological processes? And for this purpose, I draw on Marx's labor process theory, which is used by eco-Marxists to clarify the idea of this metabolism between society and nature. And I borrow this demarcation by Hahn. He looks at Marxist labor process theory and divides it into two elements: material metabolism, in which labor is seen as a metabolic process which is subject to a physiological or material component grounded in natural sciences and therefore concerned with the material interlinkages between nature and society. And then there's a more abstract component called purpose realization, in which labor is seen as the imposition of human intention on nature, causing nature or ecological processes to capitulate to humanity's will. Purpose realization is also the endowment then of natural objects with humanistic forms for a specific purpose. So against the backdrop of this demarcation of the labor process, I argue that for a given production process that depends on an ecological process, the material metabolism component is orchestrated either by labor, waged workers, or capitalists, and that this distinction depends on whether the ecological process or entity is appropriated or capitalized. Then when it comes to this more abstract component, purpose realization, I argue that when an ecological entity is in its appropriated state, it's endowed with humanistic forms for the purpose of use value extraction. Instead, in its capitalized state, it is additionally endowed also for the purpose of exchange value accumulation. And so the question then becomes, how can one formalize labor's entanglement with an ecological process? And secondly, how to display this contribution of an appropriated ecological process to production itself. The suggestion that I have in mind that I propose in the dissertation is situated in a neo-Ricardian microeconomic framework based on two sectors, in which I take the price of the agricultural commodity as a numeraire, and I treat the wage rate as exogenous because I assume a dual economy with a subsistence sector which dictates the subsistence wage. And so in the following table, you can see a simple representation of the production processes. So the agricultural production process depends on seed input, agricultural commodity itself, industrial commodity, and a labor input, and the industrial production process instead only depends on an industrial commodity and a labor input. This doesn't cause any problems because the wage basket consists of the agricultural commodity, and so through the simple system of linear equation, I can derive the relative prices and the rate of profit. So what is my idea of allowing appropriated ecological processes to contribute to the production process? So if I were to abstract from appropriated ecological processes, the production function would take the following shape, which is a simple fixed coefficient Leontief function. Instead, I allow appropriated ecological, not only ecological processes, but also labor processes to influence the technical coefficients in the agricultural sector. So we can see here that the coefficient which dictates the amount of seed that is necessary for production is a function of this metabolic parameter. And above that, when it comes to labor, I allow this kind of appropriation of labor to take place through the measure of labor intensity. Now, in the classical Marxist tradition, labor intensity is the amount of labor expended per hour of production, and it is a key determinant of absolute surplus value extraction, or absolute increases in labor exploitation. But we're operating in a neo-Ricardian framework, so labor exploitation is considered to be redundant for two reasons. First, the existence of a physical surplus already explains positive profits. And secondly, the choice of labor power as the unit of measure to explain exploitation is arbitrary. Since it's already a physicalist framework, any other commodity can be used to tell the same story. Nevertheless, I argue that labor intensity could still be considered as relevant for the purpose of explaining the unique social relationship that exists between capitalists and workers. That is, capitalists are able to reorganize production or simply demand workers to exert more effort per hour of production without necessarily increasing their costs, but increasing their production levels. So this is because increases in the labor intensity decrease labor productivity or improve labor productivity. And so since the wage bill follows the real labor coefficient, it's possible to think of adjustment in labor intensity as increases in labor appropriation. But apart from that, one could also think of the variability in the measure of labor intensity as the result of labor that's being conducted in the sphere of reproduction, such as care and household work. And so in this way, incorporating a measure of labor intensity, even in a neo-Ricardian framework, it's kind of able to capture an element of social reproduction. However, when we consider the sphere of reproduction, this wouldn't necessarily artificially improve the measure of labor productivity. It could actually also deteriorate the measure of labor productivity. In the rest of the presentation, I will focus on the first labor intensity type, which improves the labor productivity measure. So let's go to the metabolic parameters. So as I said, one of the technical coefficients, in this case, seed, is a function of the metabolic parameter at a previous period in time, t, so it's a lagged variable. And I follow Marx's labor process theory in defining this metabolic parameter that takes a value between 0 and 1, and it's divided in a material component and in a cognitive component, which is meant to capture this abstract idea of purpose realization. Now, the material component is a quadratic function of the wage basket and the labor coefficient, adjusted for labor intensity. And so since this represents the compensation per hour of production, in the original framework of Marx and his description of agricultural production at the time of the Industrial Revolution, this kind of serves as a proxy for the amount of nutrients returned to the soil, relatively to an exogenous optimum, which is n in the following formulation. And the quadratic nature of this function with respect to this material component captures the well-known characteristic of the environmental Kuznets curve, which dictates that higher material well-being leads to increased environmental awareness and so pro-environmental behavior up to a certain turning point. Or coming back to the specific example that I'm dealing with right now, returning an above optimal amount of nutrients to the soil will also result in negative impacts on soil fertility. Then the fact that the material component is also a function of the labor coefficient captures the stylized fact in agricultural production that usually more labor-intensive agricultural practices tend to be more sustainable. Usually it's not always the case, but. And then finally, the other component of this metabolic parameter is this cognitive component, which is simply an inverse function of the measure of labor intensity amplified by this parameter alpha, which simply captures the relative weight of the cognitive component with respect to the material component. So if we look at the full formulation of this metabolic parameter, we see that the positive or negative effect of the material component is diminished or amplified by the cognitive component, but that the material component in and of itself is also moderated by this measure of labor intensity. Then when it comes to the impact on the actual technical coefficient, this is a simple linear formalization in which I impose a maximum to the seed coefficient, which is reached when the metabolic parameter is equal to 0, and the minimum when the metabolic parameter is equal to 1. So in this way, the appropriation of labor and the state of the appropriated ecological process are intrinsically linked to each other, but more importantly, they both affect the production process without being capitalized through the impact on technical coefficients. The only difference between the seed coefficient and the labor coefficient is that capitalists are aware of the impact of the labor intensity increases on the labor coefficient, while they are not aware of the impact on the state of the ecological process, as this is due, the impact is lagged in time. So now I will present very simple comparative static exercise where I try to represent this movement in the ecological surplus and the implications for the profit rate. So the first is the classical neo-Ricardian example considering fertility. So if we imagine an exogenous increase in soil fertility, like a shift to cultivation on lands of higher fertility, then of course for a given wage rate, this increases the rate of profit because the capitalized seed input is rendered more efficient. And so increase in the ecological surplus results in an increase in the profit rate, the short-term profit rate. But what happens when we increase the labor intensity measure? An exogenous increase in the labor intensity measure for a given wage rate, first, of course, it will increase the rate of profit due to the artificially increased labor coefficient. Unlike pure labor productivity increases, however, this does not increase the maximum wage because this is limited by the normal labor coefficient. In any case, because the ecological process and the labor process are linked to each other, increasing labor intensity renders the soil fertility suboptimal. And so the long-term effect is a decrease in the quality of the appropriated ecological process, which renders the capitalized seed input less efficient and ultimately decreases the ecological surplus and thereby the rate of profit. Then the final example is an exogenous increase in the wage rate, which of course can be seen as an exogenous increase in the capitalized labor. And this lowers the rate of profit, but again, due to the connection between labor and ecological processes through the material component, this may either improve or deteriorate the appropriated ecological process depending on which side of the parabola you are. So it could be that we have already reached the turning point in which an increase in the material component will deteriorate the ecological process, or the other way around, it might improve the ecological process. So now I will shortly conclude. So first of all, this exercise is limited to a very simplified representation of agricultural production and its entanglement specifically with soil fertility as an appropriated ecological process. And there are many open issues and things to consider. For example, the concrete measurement of this ecological surplus and particularly the appropriation component. This is still an open question and something that I'm working on what could data reveal on anything determining appropriated ecological processes, but also labor processes. And then I introduced this kind of ecologically determined technical change. And as you may recall, the seed coefficient is a function of this metabolic parameter at some previous time t. And so this also needs more, I need to think more specifically about this, whether this impact is the time at which this impact occurs, whether it's stochastic, whether it's deterministic, etc. And then more importantly, of course, this example is limited to agricultural production and very close to what Marx has written, which was already 150 years ago. So of course, it's important to think about extrapolation to the broader and more contemporary issue that we are facing right now, which is climate change. And for this, I have some ideas in mind, which is to regard time use surveys and the intensity of the carbon intensity of activities occurring outside of the sphere of production, where my hypothesis is that an engagement, a higher engagement in carbon-intensive activities outside of the sphere of production may reveal, on the one hand, that material well-being has passed this tipping point in the parabola, where more richer households tend to engage in more carbon-intensive leisure activities or transport activities, but it could also reveal that there's a higher measure of labor intensity occurring in the sphere of work, in the sphere of production, and so that exhausting working conditions may have counterintuitive effects on the carbon intensity of activities outside of the sphere of production, in the sphere of reproduction, for example, and that this may render some environmental policies less effective. And then this can also reveal a higher measure of labor intensity in the sphere of reproduction in and of itself. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Shannon, thank you very much for your presentation. I think that we are going to have a very interesting thesis that your work, I'm sure, about this. Yeah, and thanks to take part of our workshop.
You're
Well,
welcome.
we are ending our first international workshop of the Structuralist Development Research Group. And I would like to say that in name of José Oreiro and my name, to give a big thank you to three persons that was very important for this conference, for this workshop. That without their effort, it would be impossible to have this workshop, and that is Marvel Davila. Thanks, Marvela. Marvela was very worked a lot, very involved since the beginning of the idea to have the conference, and also two other more junior, I would say, economists, member of our group, also that they are fantastic in their efforts and their work. That was Luciano Pereira da Silva. Thank you so much, Luciano. And also Daniel Moura, that is here in this section with us. Both of them dedicate a lot to this conference, and other members of the group, all the participants of the workshop. Is very successful workshop. We intend to have other workshops, and this was just the beginning, and hope to for whom who want to integrate our group, and also hope that we are going to promote other workshop, seminar, and so on. So thank you so much. Have a nice weekend, and see you soon. Bye.